it's Aaron Bulma here. So, serving as military specialist for Carleton County, I'm going to do another presentation tonight. So this is going to start the next series. I'm doing the World War II timeline. I'm also going to do the Canada in World War One timeline. Okay, so this is talking about Canada's first battle, Neuve Chapelle. Now, this battle, of course, took place in the First World War in 1915. It actually took place from March 10th to March 13th, 1915. And so this attack was intended to cause a rupture in the German lines, which would then be exploited with a rush to the Aubers Ridge and possibly Lyle. So this here, Artois, is where this took place. And of course, in France, in this region, is where this battle happened. And of course, there's lots of casualties. But this is the first battle where Canada is actually Canadian soldiers, the CEF, the Canadian Expeditionary Force, are um, actually taking part in. So, starting off with the First World War, of course, the bloodiest conflict in Canadian history, taking the lives from 61,000 to 67,000 Canadians. It erased romantic notions of the war, of course, introducing slaughter on a massive scale and instilling a fear of foreign military involvement that would last until the Second World War, and it certainly did. Even in the United States, it did. Um, Reluctance on America to get involved in this war. Also, there was reluctance on America to get involved in the Second World War. But that, of course, was here in Canada as well. The great achievements of Canadian soldiers on battlefields such as Ypres, Vimy, Passchendaele, however, ignited a sense of national pride and confidence that Canada could stand on its own, apart from the British Empire, on the world stage. The war is also deepened. Of course, it also deepened the divide between the French, English, and English Canada, and marked the beginning of widespread state intervention in society and the economy. Of course, the war started in August 1914 after the assassination of the Archduke of Ferdinand. And of course, it would last for more than 4 years and kill about 9 million people in uniform. Well, so 30 million altogether is 30, about 30 million. Um, from different, of course, it differs. In the same time period, the war and other violent conflicts would kill an estimated 20 million civilians. So, the World War, the world, of course, this is being the first ever global war on proportions. The world would never be the same. Of course, with major powers in Europe had been preparing for war for years. The situation was so tense before the war that many called Europe a powder keg waiting to explode. Key factors of the buildup of the war, of course, the arms race to build bigger and more powerful armies and navies with Germany and England, between Germany and England, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Italy, the Triple Entente and Triple Alliance, which would become growing disputes over trade and land, dissatisfaction with the balance of power in Europe, and resentment from the legacy of past grievances. So the Central Powers, the Triple Entente or Allies, which would be us. So Great Britain, and of course we were part of the Commonwealth. So Canada would certainly be part of that. When Great Britain went to war, we went to war. So Great Britain, Tsarist Russia, and France, the Triple Entente or Allies, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, and then eventually Italy. Um, Italy, essentially allied to the Central Powers, refused to be drawn into what is it viewed as their war of aggression. In May 1915, Italy joined the Entente, hoping to acquire territory from Austria-Hungary and new colonial possessions, mainly in Africa. So, of course, the assassination and going in the next, of course, that's talking about Italy. The assassination sparks the war with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June 1914, set off a chain of events that led to the war in early August 1914. The assassination was traced to a Serbian extremist group that wanted to increase Serbian power in the Balkans by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire attacked Serbia in response. Germany supported Austro-Hungary while Russia sided with its traditional ally, Serbia. When Russia mobilized its military forces at the end of July, Germany sought to avoid a two-front war by a quick invasion of France. Of course, Russia's main ally was France at the time. German troops moved on France by invading Belgium, a country that had been neutral for nearly 100 years. On the 3rd of August, Britain, fulfilling its obligation to support Belgium in their neutrality, declared war the next day. So, and of course, Britain declaring war, and of course, we went to war. So on August 4th, 1914, Canada, as a member of the British Empire, was at war. And so we would contribute over 500,000 soldiers to this conflict. So the Canadian Parliament didn't choose to go to war in 1914. The country's foreign affairs were guided in London, of course. So when Britain's ultimatum to Germany to withdraw its army from Belgium expired on the 4th of August 1914, the British Empire, including Canada, was at war, allied with Serbia, Russia, and France against the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. The war united Canadians at first. The Liberal opposition urged Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden's Conservative government to take sweeping powers under the new War Measures Act. Ministry of Militia Sam Hughes summoned 25,000 volunteers to train at a new camp in Valcartier near Quebec. Some 33,000 appeared. On the 3rd of October, the first contingent of 30,617 men sailed for England. Much of Canada's war effort was launched by volunteers. The Canadian Patriotic Fund collected money to support soldiers' families. Military hospitals commissioned cared for the sick and wounded. Churches, charities, women's organizations, and the Red Cross found ways to do their bit for the war effort. In patriotic fervor, Canadians demanded that Germans and Austrians be dismissed from their jobs and interned, and pressured Berlin, Ontario, to rename itself Kitchener. So it used to be Berlin, Ontario. So here is just a poster of the Canadian Patriotic Fund of the First World War. And of course, so this is trying to get people to donate in war bonds, which would fund the war for Canada and for the British Empire. At first, the war hurt a troubled economy, increasing unemployment and making it hard for Canada's new debt-ridden transcontinental railways, the Canadian Northern and the Grand Trunk Pacific, to find credit. By 1915, however, military spending equaled the entire government expenditure of 1913. Minister of Finance Thomas White opposed raising taxes. Since Britain could not afford to lend to Canada, White turned to the United States. Also, despite the belief that Canadians would never lend to their own government, White had to take the risk. Of course, he had to take the risk. In 1915, he asked for 50 million. He got 100 million. In 1917, the government's Victory Loan Campaign began raising huge sums of money from ordinary citizens for the first time. Canada's war effort was financed mainly by borrowing. Between 1913 and 1918, the national debt rose from 463 million to 2.46 billion, an enormous sum at that time. Canada's economic burden would have been unbearable without huge exports of wheat, timber, and munitions. A pre-war crop failure had been a warning to prairie farmers of future droughts, but a bumper crop in 1915 and soaring prices banished caution. Since many farm laborers had joined the army, farmers began to complain of a labor shortage. It was hoped that factories shut down by the recession would profit from the war. Manufacturers formed a shell committee got, got contracts to make British artillery ammunition, and created a new industry. It was not easy. By summer 1915, the committee had orders worth 170 million, but had delivered only 5.5 million in shells. The British government insisted on reorganization. The resulting Imperial Munitions Board was a British agency in Canada, though headed by a talented, hard-driven Canadian, Joseph Flavel. By 1917, Flavel had made the IMBs Canada's biggest business, with 250,000 workers. When the British stopped buying in Canada in 1917, Flavel negotiated huge new contracts with the Americans. Recruiting at home, of course, unemployed workers flocked to enlist in 1914 and 1915, like seen here. Recruiting, handled by pre-war militia regiments and by civic organizations, cost the government nothing. By the end of 1914, the target for the Canadian Expeditionary Force was 50,000. By the summer of 1915, it was 150,000. During a visit to England that summer, Prime Minister Borden was shocked with the magnitude of the struggle. To demonstrate Canadian commitment to the war effort, Borden used his 1916 New Year's message to plead 500,000 soldiers from a Canadian population of barely 8 million. By then, volunteering had virtually run dry. Early contingents had been filled, but recent British immigrants enlistments in 1915 had taken most of the Canadian-born who were willing to go. The total 330,000 was impressive, but insufficient. Here's some of our soldiers overseas. One of the at least one of the rear trenches from supply and medical aid. Recruiting methods became fervid and divisive. Clergy preached Christian duty. Women wore badges proclaiming knit or fight. More and more English Canadians complained that French Canada was not doing its share. This was not surprising. Few French Canadians felt deep loyalty to France or Britain. Those few in Borden's government had won election in 1911 by opposing imperialism. Henry Bourassa, leader and spokesman of Quebec's nationalists, initially approved of the war, but soon insisted that French Canada and French Canada's real enemies were not Germans, but English Canadian Anglicisters. The Ontario Indigenous or Irish priests who were busy ending French language education in English-speaking provinces like Ontario. In Quebec and across Canada, unemployment gave way to high wages and a manpower shortage. There were good economic reasons to stay home. More than 4,000 Indigenous men volunteered for overseas service with the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. Modern historians and other researchers have shown that a few thousand more Indigenous soldiers volunteered without self-identifying as Indigenous on their recruitment forms. Historian Timothy Weingard has revealed that recruitment and volunteerism of Indigenous soldiers breaks down into 3 phases. The first phase, from August 1914 to December 1915, the Army unofficially accepted Indigenous soldiers, particularly status Indians. Of course, First Nations men with legal Indian status. In other words, they allowed them to enlist but did not actively recruit them. In second phase, from December of 1915 to December 1916, the Canadian government and the Department of Indian Affairs relaxed restrictions against Indigenous volunteers as casualties grew for the CEF after deadly battles like the Second Battle of Ypres 1915 and the Battle of the Somme in 1916. The third phase took place from 1917 to the end of the war. In the third phase, Indigenous volunteers were officially encouraged as voluntary enlistment dried up across Canada, and Prime Minister Robert Borden decided to institute conscription, mandatory military service. The Military Service Act (MSA) of August 1917, which declared conscription of men aged 20 to 45, initially included Indigenous men except for Inuit men, regardless of their legal Indian status. Although First Nations and other Indigenous men were exempted from the MSA in January 1918, many more continued to volunteer through the end of the war. It is estimated that more than 1,200 Indigenous soldiers were killed or wounded in the First World War. Amazing. And that's one thing that a lot of people forget is even in the Second World War and onward, we have people here in Woodstock at the Willistic First Nation who served in the first, in Second World War, a lot of Second World War ones, and onward. Um, and I know some of them that have served, in Vietnam. I mean, Roger Polches being one of them, and so we have definitely a lot of military history just locally that people don't know about that should appreciate. The Canadian Expeditionary Force. These pictures here are of our 26th Battalion that went in April 1915. And so these are some of the guys who went in 1915. Where's some of the earlier crew that go over? The 26th Battalion, of course, is formed from a lot of regiments within all over New Brunswick. And a famous regiment, they fought in they fought in Somme, they fought in Vimy, they fought in Hill 70. Oh my goodness, they many different battles. And so you have the Hindenburg Line, Amiens, Passchendaele, Scarpe in 1719, Arles, of course, Vimy, and Keur Heights, the Val, Flers-Courcelette, of course, the Somme in Mount Sorel. In this battalion, of course, the Canadian government at the time was, and shortly after the first contingent of the CEF that left for England, Canada, the government of Canada authorized the recruiting of a second contingent of volunteers. And the 15 battalions were recruited, trained, and mobilized during the winter of the First World War, the first winter, 1914-1915. In New Brunswick, we raised the battalion known as the Fighting 26th. And of course, the 26th, our battle honors are the battle honors are very impressive. It's amazing. I mean, we have an incredible history from which this battalion, and I have some artifacts from my museum of the 26th Battalion. It's amazing what we've been able to do. I mean, I have friends and family that were members of the 26th, and so the Canadian Expeditionary Force. It became part of the British Army. It was the Canadian Expeditionary Force for the British Army. As Minister of Militia, Sam Hughes insisted on choosing the officers and on retaining the Canadian-made Ross rifle. And of course, so there was Ross Mark 1, Mark 2, and mainly the Mark 3 is the one that we were using in the First World War. And by 1916, we needed to replace them. They were very unreliable in the mud, in the dirt. They would jam, or they could blow back in your hand, blowing off fingers. They were not very reliable. Serious deficiencies, definitely. Jammed easily, and some of Hughes' choices were incompetent. Since the rifle jammed easily, and since some of Hughes' choices were incompetent cronies, the Canadian military had serious deficiencies at the time, and so what we would replace it with the Lee Enfield number 1 Mark 3, and which was a much more reliable and superior rifle. Fired the same round, which is 3-03 British. A recruiting system based on forming hundreds of new battalions, and that was going into the weapons and back to the battalions. Our recruiting system for the battalions, based on forming hundreds of new battalions, meant that most of them arrived in England only to be broken up, leaving a large residue of unhappy senior officers. He was believed that Canadian civilians, rather than professional soldiers, would make natural soldiers. In practice, they had many costly lessons to learn. They did so with courage and self-sacrifice. We formed, so the 26th Battalion is just one of many. The 26th Battalion, so we have the 67th Carleton Light Infantry, which formed into that. The 71st York Regiment, they formed in with that. Then the, of course, St. John Fusiliers, the 74th, and the 62nd, I believe. And so we have numerous ones. Even we have even the 12th, and then of course the 104th Battalion that went over as well. So that is just some of the local history of some of the local units that went overseas. Now, of course, so March 10th to the 12th, 1915, the first battle that Canadian contingents took part in. Of course, Neuve Chapelle is aptly named as it provided a new role for Canadian troops who had just arrived from Salisbury Plain in England, where they had been, in course, training. While not a large battle, it was not without significance from a Canadian perspective, in that it was the first time that the Canadian Expeditionary Force had been fully involved in action with the enemy. Canadian war diaries for the period immediately leading up to the battle document the move of the Canadians from England to France in February. The additional training and orientation undertaken in February and in early March, and the first taste of action in mid-March at Neuve Chapelle. So that, of course, this is as the 26th Battalion is in the second wave, preparing to go to England. Our first part for the first initial waves, first battalions in the first initial wave is now getting their baptism of fire at Neuve Chapelle. Their role in the battle order to prevent the Germans in this sector from reinforcing the combat zone. So this would allow the British First Army under General Sir Douglas Haig to successfully push through German lines and establish a new Allied front line on conquered territory. Despite this success, however, the British missed a golden opportunity to exploit their advantage. Owing to a poor communication system, they were unable to change the orders, which restricted the troops from advancing before receiving an explicit order to retake the offensive. The main lessons of Neuve Chapelle were as follows: that artillery bombardment was too light to suppress the enemy trenches. And so they had maybe hundreds of guns, but they did not have nearly enough shells. They did not have enough firepower to lay down. That more good artillery observation points were necessary, so to pinpoint where they needed artillery to go and which coordinates they needed. And that reserves were too few to follow up success quickly, and most importantly, that the procedure of transmitting information and sending orders to the advanced troops were slow and difficult. And that's a major aspect of warfare, is you need to get the right information to your commanding officers immediately, or as soon as possible, so that they can either warn them of incoming danger or ordering them to take the initiative to move ahead. All about timing. An attack is all about timing, taking the initiative, your timing of your artillery, your timing of your observation, and finding out intelligence of what the strength is of the enemy. That the procedure of transmitting information and sending orders to the advanced troops was slow and difficult, and that being slow and difficult would hinder efforts to push forward, and actually could be very costly for Canadian soldiers. That could be which Germans could see as they're approaching the lines. They could be at positions where, why are we waiting? We're getting picked off here, right? So you need to push ahead so that and to keep the pressure on the enemy so that they don't push back as far. And that the systems of communication were much too vulnerable. So cutting off communications. If you can't communicate with your troops, you can't tell them to pull back in case of advancing enemies in positions. You can't tell them to push forward or to maneuver, which is it's if you don't have proper communications or if they're cut, that's a critical point of failure. That's a critical failure, and of course, this had happened. Um, this is a map here, Neuve Chapelle in France. So Neuve Chapelle is right on the border. It's right actually on the border, near the border with Belgium and Antwerp and Lille. So right on the coast, right on the water, and they're pushing inward. And this is an area. It's roughly about 1,800 people. It's past the Calais, and so this was a small battle in the First World War, but it was a test for Canadian soldiers of the Expeditionary Force. You can see here the cavalry, and so here trenches, Smith Doreen Trench, Sunken Road. This is a map of where. So we have the 25th Infantry Brigade and the 23rd Infantry Brigade pushing in. So in these ones, in the London R, S&M. So these are the units that are pushing inward, and that's Canadian and British as well. Pictures here of this early brutal campaign. So the objectives in 1915 were to remain the same throughout the war, to break through the German defense lines that spanned the totally occupied territory of northern France. And of course, when the Germans pushed through Belgium and then into France, and of course their attack was halted before as they marched on to Paris. And of course and now we're at the point of where it's going to stay for the next 2 years, right, of the war. It's not going to change much until 1917. So a lot of it is trench warfare. You take a quarter of a kilometer and they take it back. And in months, sometimes battles are lasting months, or in positions, such as the Somme, take months. Sometimes these will take months or weeks. But small battles like this took 3 days. But what's ahead is a long and arduous campaign. A lot of death, a lot of pain and suffering, definitely. One of the intermediate objectives of this plan was to force a breach through the enemy's communication center on the Dorey Plain. To achieve this, the French army planned to join with the British and attack eastward between Arras and Lens, capture the high ground at Vimy, and dominate the entire Douro region. Owing, however, to the French army's increased presence at Gallipoli, the British First Army under General Sir Douglas Haig was obliged to begin the operation alone, and Haig's immediate objective was to attack from his position just east of the village of Neuve Chapelle. And here's a painting of Battle of Neuve Chapelle. So this battle was significant for the Canadians because, of course, it was the first time that we were involved in this in action with the enemy, right? With the exception of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, which had effected a raid on February 28th. So that was the exception, February 28th, 1915, which when serving with a British brigade. So that really, in essence, this is the first major offensive for Canadian soldiers in as a whole, except for the what I've explained, the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry on the 28th of February. The 1st Canadian Division had just moved to France from training at Salisbury Plain, England. So initially, the first major blood for Canadians is here. But of course, yes, there's one unit that had a pinprick of battle, pinprick of baptism of fire, which is Princess, Princess Patricia's Canadian Line Infantry. This is the, like I'm explaining, this is the first major forward offensive the Canadians are really pushing hard for. Um, so they were playing England and prepared for its first experience of a set piece battle. Itself a first for the British, who had until then served a purely defensive role in the Allied war effort. So Neuve Chapelle and the Fleurberg sector. Neuve Chapelle, a village situated less than a kilometer from the front line trenches, was a smattering of houses at the epicenter of the British First Army's line. The village lay a short distance from northeast of the French Second Army front, which extended southward from the Canal Le Bossé between Lens and Arras, themselves separated by the strategically important Vimy Ridge, a 6,400-meter sector in front of Fleurberg was occupied by the Canadians. Since water levels in this region lay close to the surface, trenches were shallow and consisted more or less of parapets formed by clumps of grass and sandbags. These trenches overlooked fields separated by rows of beheaded willow trees that lined the ditches, offering German sharpshooters cover and strategic advantage. About 6 kilometers to the east, Burr's Ridge partially blocked the view of to the city of Lille, which was situated approximately 14 kilometers from the front lines. The German lines in the immediate vicinity were very lightly defended. The night before the attack was wet with light snow, which turned to damp mist on the 10th of March. So this is actually the headquarters of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade at Fleurberg. Of course, 6,400-meter sector in front of the French Ville de Fleurberg was occupied by Canadians at the time of their first active service during the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Brigade, one of the units that made up the 1st Canadian Division, which fought at Neuve Chapelle, set up headquarters at Fleurberg. So the plan, a diversionary role for the Canadians. So our plan was directed as this: to the British First Army's left, the First Canadian Division was to open fire along its front in order to divert the enemy and prevent the Germans from reinforcing the main combat zone through which the British intended to advance on Neuve Chapelle. Quite simply, if the British Army to the right managed to break through, the Canadians stood ready to advance under British orders. So Lieutenant General Erwin Alfred Hervey Alderson, born 1859 to 1927, he was commander of the 1st Canadian Division 1914-1915. He actually commanded was the Canadian Army Corps from 1915-1916. The Inspector General of Canadian Forces 1916 to 1918. Under orders from the British commander, Lieutenant General Sir E.A.H. Alderson. The Canadian Division had begun almost as soon as it moved to the front in February 1915. A routine of night patrolling, sustained sniping, and quick attacks against enemy trenches. And this is from Library and Archives Canada, a Department of National Defense collection of the First World War. So the plan, massive bombardment to surprise the enemy, and of course communications, since the Canadians' role was to divert the enemy by funneling the German resources away from the main battle zone, so drawing them out to the side so the British can hit them on the main front line. The assault had to take the form of a massive bombardment followed by salvos of rapid machine gun fire aimed at sustaining the diversion. Once the Germans had engaged in defending the sector from where the Canadians attacked, the primordial role of issuing orders to exploit the breach created along the line devolved to the British Army's communications system. Information had to circulate to the front line rapidly in order to permit a simultaneous advance of all troops and prevent the enemy from mustering reinforcements to counterattack. So taking Neuve Chapelle and the push eastward to Lille. In this first set-piece battle devised by the British, the overall objective was to break into enemy positions, take Neuve Chapelle, suppress enemy trenches by bombardments, and follow up by reaching Lille. So the preparations that they had, observation patrols, sniping, and quick attacks, which of course under Alderson. A common feature of trench warfare for the Canadians who saw action for the first time was the night patrol, a preliminary to the actual attack, under orders from their British commander, Lieutenant General Sir E.A.H. Alderson. The Canadian division had begun almost as soon as it had moved to the front in February 1915. A routine of night patrolling, sustained sniping, and quick attacks against enemy trenches. So moving into hidden positions, sniping out, taking out German observers or German machine gun nests to, in a sense, confuse the enemy, to poke and prod him, patrolling for intelligence, trying to find out how thick the German lines were, and establishing these quick attacks, try to weaken the enemy and try to test them. These preparations were carried out with the objective of lowering enemy morale and keeping the Germans on the defensive, keeping them guessing at all times. On the 10th of March, at 7:30 a.m. 0 hour, the Canadian Divisional Artillery barraged enemy positions. The attack was launched 35 minutes later with gunners opening salvos of rapid fire that continued intermittently every 15 minutes during the whole day. The tactic was successful. It caught the enemy entirely by surprise. In less than 20 minutes, a 1,600-meter breach was created in the German line. At 0900 hours, British troops had swept Neuve Chapelle without encountering any resistance. Advancing units had received the order to halt at a predetermined line and wait for their general headquarters to give them the go-ahead to continue. This is where the offensive, successful until now, completely broke down. Telephone and telegraph lines, which were much too vulnerable, had been quickly destroyed by German shelling. The transmission of information from headquarters to troops all along the front line was, as a result, too slow for attacking unit commanders to know that they had before them a golden opportunity to rapidly exploit the territory gained at the center of the advancing line. It was only at 5 p.m. that all brigades, battalions, and companies finally resumed their advance, just as the sun was setting and the day's operations had to stop. Despite poor weather, the early stages of the battle went extremely well for the British. The RFC quickly secured aerial dominance and set about bombarding railways and German reserves en route. At 7:30 a.m. on the 10th of March, the British began a 35-minute artillery bombardment with 90 18-pounder guns of the Indian Corps and the 4th Corps on the German wire, which was destroyed within 10 minutes. The remaining 15 18-pounder field gun batteries, 6 6-inch howitzers siege batteries, and 6 QF 4.5-inch howitzer batteries with 6 howitzers fired on the German front line trenches. The trenches were 3 feet, 0.91 meters deep, with breastworks 4 feet high, but were unable to withstand a howitzer bombardment. The 1st Canadian Division at Flaubert, several kilometers northeast of Neuve Chapelle, provided artillery support and machine gun fire as a diversion to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the sector. The artillery bombardment was followed by an infantry assault at 08:05 a.m. The Garthwal Brigade of the Murat Division Indian Corps attacked with all 4 battalions on a 600-yard front from Port Arthur to Port Laguet. On the right, the attack quickly collapsed, both companies losing direction and veering to the right. The attack confronted a part of the German defenses that had not been bombarded by the artillery, and before the mistake was realized, the 2 support companies followed suit. The Indian troops forced their way through the German wire and took 200 yards, 180 meters of the German front trench, despite many casualties. The 3 Gold battalions to the left advanced in lines of platoon 50 paces apart, swiftly crossing the 200-yard of no man's land, overran the German infantry and pressed on to the German support trench. The attack taking only 15 minutes. The leading companies then advanced beyond the Port Arthur Neuve Chapelle road without waiting for the planned 30-minute artillery preparation and took the village by 9 a.m. 0900 hours, along with 200 prisoners and 5 machine guns. The Germans a lot of times would able to use German MG 08-15 machine guns. These are, of course, effective, powerful machine guns, and some of these, a lot of them are, of course, the British, they will use the Vickers Mark I, and then of course the Lewis gun, which will come out and is one of the world's first light machine guns. A gap of 250 yards, 230 meters, had been created by the loss of direction on the right, where the German garrison had been severely bombarded, but the survivors, about 2 platoons of the 10th Company Infantry Regiment 16, fought on. A fresh British attack was arranged from the north, in which the Garthwal Brigade were to join in with a frontal assault. German troops infiltrated northwards before being forced back by bombers. The Grenadier Guards had objected to specialist grenade throwers usurping their name and bayonet charges, but the Indian attack was stopped by the Germans. 200 yards south of Port Arthur, Neuve Chapelle Road. Haig ordered more attacks that day, with similarly disappointing results. The German defenses in the center were quickly overrun at 1,600 yards. 1,500 meters front, and Neuve Chapelle was captured by 10 a.m. At Haig's request, the British Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir John French, released the 5th Cavalry Brigade to exploit the expected breakthrough. On the left of the attack, 2 companies of Jaguar Battalion 11 with C-200 men and a machine gun delayed the advance for more than 6 hours until forced to retreat, which left no time to resume the advance. Although aerial photography had been useful, it was not sufficient to identify not able to effectively identify German strong points. Primarily, communications also meant that the British commanders had been unable to keep in touch with each other. The battle became uncoordinated, and this disrupted the delivery of supplies. On 12th of March, the 6th Army, Crown Prince Ruprecht counterattacked. The attempt failed, but forced the British to use most of their artillery ammunition. The British offensive was postponed on 13th of March and abandoned 2 days later. Here's some of the guys at Neuve Chapelle injured or have come back afterward. And here's some of them on some of the trenches during these days. On the morning of the 11th of March, the British twice faced the enemy force they had encountered the previous morning. During the whole day, the Canadians repeated the role they assumed on 10th of March, this time without any of the previous day's results. Twice the British attempted to resume the offensive, but because the Germans had ample time to muster fresh troops, the British no longer knew where the enemy batteries were located and could not sustain the operation. The advance halted for the day. Before the dawn on the 12th of March, the Germans bombarded Allied positions and counterattacked with 20 battalions. The British units, however, were well prepared, and the enemy was pushed back successfully. Once again, though, previous others designed to prepare an advance at 10:30 a.m. prevented frontline troops from exploiting this new advantage, and there was a further delay in the offensive, complicated by thick fog. When the British attack was finally launched, it resulted in heavy losses. Despite rumors of spectacular gains that caused the Canadian 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Brigades to prepare and to advance, the Canadians remained in their trenches, and by 8:40 p.m., 2040 hours, General Haig saw no other recourse but to order the establishment of a new line of defense on newly conquered territory. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle was over. The British sustained 12,892 losses, of which 100 were Canadian. So basically our first major blood loss, in a sense, major casualty count. The strength of the British and Canadians were 4 divisions against Germans of 2 divisions. The casualties, 7,000 British alone, 4,200 Indian British soldiers, colonial troops. And then the British included 100, so 6,900 British, including 100 Canadians. From the 9th to the 20th of March, altogether, the casualties of the Germans were 8.5, so 8,500 to 10,000 German casualties. And of course, different areas, of course, different resources will differ in numbers just by a little bit. There were 40,000 troops in this offensive, so 6,900, including 100 Canadian, 4,200 British Indian troops. The 7th Division suffered 2,791 casualties, the 8th Division 4,814, the Merit Division 2,353, and the Lahore Division 1,694. In 2010, Humphreys and Maker recorded German casualties from the 9th to the 20th of March as about 10,000 men, like I've explained. In 2018, Jonathan Buff wrote that the British suffered 12,592 casualties and that the German official history estimated of almost 10,000 men was closer to 8,500, so roughly 8,500 to 10,000. According to the records of the 6th Army and the diary kept by Crown Prince Ruprecht, the 6th Bavarian Reserve Division suffered 6,017 casualties from the 11th to the 13th of March. Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 21, Regiment 21 suffered about, they're saying, 1,665 casualties. Infantry Regiment 14 of the 7th Corps suffered 666 casualties from the 7th to the 12th of March, and Infantry Regiment 13 suffered 1,322 casualties from the 6th to the 27th of March. During its divisional assault in support of the main offensive, the Canadian 1st Division suffered 300 casualties, nearly 100 fatal. So roughly around 200 wounded and 100 fatal Canadian dead. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle showed that trench defenses could be breached if the attack was carefully prepared and disguised to achieve at least local surprise. After the initial shock, the German defenders recovered just as the attackers were beset by delays, loss of communication, and disorganization. In his report at the end of March, Major General John Durcan wrote that the First Army Command System disintegrated after the capture of Neuve Chapelle. Although Haig claimed he had made his intent plain to his subordinates, he felt they had not grasped the spirit of the plan and had failed to press on when initial objectives had been captured. One of the subordinates later claimed that pressing on was pointless due to lack of ammunition. The British telephone system proved vulnerable to German artillery fire, and the movement of troops along communication trenches was delayed by far more than the most pessimistic expectations. Equilibrium between attack and defense quickly resumed, which could only be upset by another set-piece attack after a delay for preparation, which gave the defenders just as much time to reorganize. The attack front was found to have been wide enough to overcome the small number of German reserves, but the attackers had not been ordered to assist units which had been held up. The British reinforcements were sent to renew failed attacks rather than reinforce success. Small numbers of German troops in strong points and isolated trenches had been able to maintain a volume of small arms fire sufficient to stop the advance for far greater number of attackers. The British had no strategic effect, but showed that the British were capable of mounting an organized attack after several winter months of static warfare. They recaptured about 2 kilometers of ground. In 1961, Alan Clark wrote that relations with the French improved because British commanders had shown themselves willing to order attacks regardless of loss, and quoted Brigadier General John Charteris that England will have to accustom herself to far greater losses than those of Neuve Chapelle before we have finished and crush the German army. All right, that's it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Aaron Boma.